I'd like to talk about what are called intrusion prevention systems. And sometimes you may also hear the notion of an intrusion detection system. And these are similar notions. I would say that the IDS is in many ways a predecessor to the current IPS. So intrusion prevention systems are also known as IPSs in the industry. And detection systems are called IDSs. Okay, so let me actually give you a bit of motivation in this video about kind of why people care about these notions. And so if you think about kind of traditional security at the network level, imagine you had some attacker, and he had a malicious payload. So imagine here's a network packet, okay, and it's really malicious. And there's the packet header, and this is the body of the packet, and this packet gets sent over a network. And let's say he's trying to compromise a system that is at the end of some enterprise. So imagine here's here's the internet, and here's a system here that belongs to an enterprise. And he wants to compromise this system or compromise maybe some system behind this enterprise. Now, the way that network security has traditionally been handled is with what's called a firewall. And a firewall, basically, imagine it's like a device that kind of stands in between a network, let's say an enterprise network, and the rest of the internet, and all traffic has to kind of go through the firewall. So let me explain kind of what the firewall does. Well, what the firewall does, or at least what a traditional firewall did, is it basically would look at this packet and it would extract out the actual packet header and look for some very basic pieces of information. So it would look for the following pieces of information. It would look at the source of the packet, and this is typically the source IP or internet protocol address of the packet. It would look at the destination IP. So where's the packet going? And then it would look at the port number. What port is that particular packet going to? And then based on these three pieces of information, it would look up these three pieces of information in a security policy. Imagine there's a security policy somewhere, and there would be a set of rules in the security policy. And these rules would say things like, if you see something at maybe at this port number or going to this port, then block that traffic entirely. Or if you see maybe this particular IP address or this particular range of IP addresses, go ahead and maybe allow that, etc. And I think in general, I mean, the way that traditional firewalls worked is they basically took kind of a block by default mode. So really the idea was that you would only allow certain packets through, and if the packet did not meet the right criteria, you would go ahead and block it. And so maybe you'll say that you only allow the following ports to be open in your firewall. Like maybe you would allow port 80, which is, let's say, the port for web traffic over HTTP. So that's an example of a port you might open in your firewall, and everything else would be blocked. Okay? Now, as it turns out, I mean, there may be situations in which, as you can imagine, where you might have something that has a malicious payload, but the actual header information, maybe the source IP or the destination IP or the actual port number, may actually look pretty benign. There may be nothing that's materially suspicious about the actual header information, but the actual content themselves could be malicious. And so in these cases, the problem with the firewall is that it's too granular. If a firewall encountered something, it would just look at these three very basic attributes, and it wouldn't be able to always make a blanket distinction about whether or not something was malicious within the context of those attributes. And I think the classic example of that would be in web applications. So nowadays, what we are seeing is we're seeing a lot of activity that is attacking web applications. And web applications reside kind of in many ways in the stack one level above the actual network layer. And so the idea is that because they're above the network layer, the actual firewall itself has little purview into what's going on in the context of web applications. And so as such, it's very possible for an attacker to create an attack that exploits a vulnerability in a web application and or maybe a web browser, and that would not be caught by the firewall, because the firewall is not actually looking at the core contents of the packet. Okay? And this is really where IPSs come into play, and also IDSs. So what you can imagine is, you've got now a second layer, and then we kind of draw that in here. Imagine you've got a second layer right here, another box. Okay, and this box might do more deep actual content inspection. So maybe examining the actual payload. So examining the actual payload and the payload refers to the actual contents of that network packet. And it might turn out that when you examine the actual contents, you will unearth attacks that you wouldn't have been able to identify if you just looked at these high-level attributes. And that really is what a IPS is designed to do. This is the main goal of an IPS is to actually examine the contents of what's going on. And I think there's actually a pretty nice analogy that one of my colleagues came up with, and I think it's helpful to kind of review that analogy here. You can think of a firewall as a security guard at a building who maybe is checking your credentials. And so maybe there's somebody at the beginning of the building who's going to basically look at whether or not you are allowed to go in that building. And you can imagine the IPS as kind of a mailroom clerk in that building. And so imagine that the security guard sees the mailman come in, and the mailman obviously, because he delivers mail on a legitimate basis most of the time, would be allowed through the building. But it's only when the actual packages are inspected by the mailroom clerk that you might infer or identify that a particular package has something malicious or bad in it. Okay? Hopefully that was pretty useful, and in future videos I will dive more into how IPSs work and more about what they do.